What's the worst fear a parent has when their child is little? That you're going to lose them, right? You've ever been in a store or something with a little kid and all of a sudden the parents lost the child? There is a frantic panic. I mean, they're running everywhere. They're going to come over the loudspeaker. And they're scared, A, that the child just might be lost. They're also scared what? Somebody took them. Somebody took my child. And they get scared. They get worried. And I mean, it's just like this living fear. And I know we were keeping our niece and nephew one time, and they were in the den watching a television show. And I said, well, I'm going to jump in the shower real quick. Y'all stay in here while I'm in the shower. Well, I get out of the shower, and they're gone. And I start walking through the house, and I can't find them anywhere. Well, my heart just starts racing. Well, they just decided they'd go out, and they were probably 6 and 4 at the time. They decided they would go out across the street over to the chicken pen and look at the chickens. But it scared me absolutely to death because they were lost. They were lost. Family means a lot to us, and protecting our family means a whole lot to us. And sometimes we get caught up in who is our family and who isn't our family and who belongs in our family and who doesn't belong in our family. And the Bible uses a whole lot of family words to describe things. I mean, it's just over and over and over again. The Bible talks using family language to describe all kinds of things. And it's sometimes hard for us to really get at what the Bible's talking about when it's talking about family. I mean, look at family. Are we judged by our family? Are you evaluated by how your children behave? Yeah, your parenting skills are judged by how your children behave, whether you want to believe it or not, okay? Yeah. Are we judged as a child by who our parents are? I'm a preacher's kid, I promise you. I know you are. All right? The one thing that kept happening to me over and over growing up is anytime anybody wanted to do something, they would come to me and say, John, go ask your dad first if he'll let you go. Because they knew if the preacher said, okay, John can go, they had no problem with their parents. It's fine. So I was always the guinea pig to see. We're judged by our parents, we're judged by our kids, and whichever direction it flows, we're evaluated by our family and who our family is. And Hebrews chapter 2 has some family language in it. Now the family language is not the main point of the chapter, but I think it gives us some points about God that we can see. So you may look at Hebrews chapter 2 and say, well, there's a whole lot of other stuff in here, John. And yes, you're right. But today we're going to talk about this stuff. And we're going to talk about in verse 10. We'll just start in Hebrews chapter 2, verse 10. And the first part of that verse says that in bringing many sons and daughters to glory, it was fitting for God. And you can go on and talk about it. He's talking about Jesus as the pioneer of our salvation. But I want you to look at that phrase, in bringing many sons and daughters to glory. Now, he's obviously talking about salvation, okay? Because he goes on and says Jesus is the pioneer of our salvation, right? So once we are saved, we bring glory to God. Do you agree with that? Well, if he says that these people who are brought to glory are sons and daughters, what does that mean they were before they were saved? They were sons and daughters before they were saved. They were sons and daughters. I think too often in the church what we have gotten caught up in is that we, the saved, are the sons and daughters of God, and everybody on the outside hadn't yet become a son and daughter of God. But reality is everybody in this world is a son or daughter of God. The problem is some of God's children are lost. And the way we feel in our heart when a child that we love and is responsible for gets lost is the way God feels when He's got children that are lost. We drive by the homeless guy and we go, oh, there's another homeless person. God looks down on the homeless guy and says, there's one of my sons or daughters who's having a problem. There's one of my sons or daughters who's lost. And it's a different perspective. Sometimes we get so caught up in this perspective that we actually look in our own congregation and we think this is our family. And in a sense, this congregation is part of our family, and that's great. But just like when you got married to somebody and you created your own family and you had your own kids and you have your own family, that does not mean you abandon the larger family, right? I mean, are grandparents still important? Anybody in here a grandparent? Are they still important? Yeah? Okay, you're still awake. Grandparents are still important. In fact, when we get married and we have kids, what do? We add to our family, right? And now the family is bigger. We though sometimes look at family on such a congregational level. And we judge this family here by how our congregation is growing. And I know it's particularly hard with the 317 ministry, because we as a family support that ministry. We as a family work with that ministry, and that ministry gets a lot of attention, as David said. A lot of attention. And then what happens is that in a year, what happens to those young ladies? They're gone. And so we look at the numbers of us without 317 and we say, well, the church isn't growing. Our family isn't growing. Our family might be shrinking. But we don't realize that our family is not this congregation. Our family that has been brought to glory is the church universal. Our family is every believer that believes in Christ. Everybody that obeys Christ is part of our family. Whether they worship here or they worship in Africa, they're part of our family. And sometimes we get so focused on this part of our family that we forget the extended family. And then, even then, sometimes we get so focused on the church universal, or the bigger picture of the church, we forget that every person alive is part of our family. Every person alive is a son or daughter of God. Every one of them. My dad grew up in a little bitty church in Tennessee, and in that little bitty church in Tennessee, in the 50s and 60s, they just couldn't grow. They were 30, 40, 50 people, something like that, and it just stayed that way, and it stayed that way. And like a lot of rural communities, when the young people grew up, guess what they did? They moved off. They left. And they left. And so by the time the 70s came around, they had actually reduced in number instead of growing, because all the young people had left. They didn't have many children. They didn't have many. And they had a preacher that came, and he could see that the congregation they were distraught because they thought their family was shrinking and there wasn't anything they could do about it. And so he went back and he remembered that there had been a guy in the 50s or 60s who had taken young men in the congregation and taught them how to preach. And so he would take them to different churches as 15-year-olds and 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds and let them learn how to preach. And when he started looking at where some of the young men who had left that congregation had gone, he found out that that one little bitty congregation had created several dozen preachers that were preaching all over the United States. And that one little bitty congregation who created all of these preachers had blessed thousands and thousands and thousands. They even had 3 missionaries come out of it. And so he began to talk to them not about the family of their congregation, but the family larger. That the things that they had done, the contribution they had given, the prayers they had offered, the work they had done, the love they had shared, that was not a blessing that was contained within their congregation. It was a blessing that was spread everywhere. And it's not just God. If you continue on and you go down to verse 11, the very next verse, it says, "But the one who makes people holy and those who are made holy are of the same family. So Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters. He says, I will declare your name to my brothers and sisters in the assembly, and I will sing your praise." How many of you got a brother or a sister? All right. They ever been ashamed of you? You ever had a brother or sister that didn't maybe at some point didn't want to admit that you were their brother or sister? My brother always said he was adopted because he didn't want to admit that he was related to me and my sister. Honestly, I think he actually looked for adoption papers, to try to prove that he wasn't related to us. Because, well, he made better grades than I did. Nobody ever said, "Oh, you're John's brother." I don't think that it was. I think it always worked out. John was your brother? What? No. We're judged sometimes by our brothers and sisters. Sometimes we're proud to have our brothers and sisters. Sometimes we're a little bit embarrassed about our brothers and sisters. Well, this says that when we are brought to glory by God, when we find that salvation, guess what? Jesus gets up and is not ashamed to call us brothers and sisters. We're God's sons and daughters, and Jesus gets up and says, "Hey, they're my brothers and sisters. I'm not ashamed of it." Well, honestly, if Jesus is not ashamed to call us brothers and sisters, how should we relate to each other? Well, we certainly shouldn't be ashamed to call each other brothers and sisters. We certainly should be willing to have that. In fact, notice the last part. I'm not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters in the assembly. And notice what he says at the last part of that verse. He says, "I will declare your brothers and sisters in the assembly, and I will sing your praises." Now, wait a minute. I will sing your praises. Whose praise is he talking about? Whose praises is Jesus going to sing? Oh, it would be easy to say, oh, that means God. He's singing God's praises. But most realistically, the way it reads, it means Jesus is so proud of us when we come to God that he starts singing our praises. Now, isn't that funny? Because who did the work? He did the work. We didn't save ourselves, did we? No, he saved us. And yet, even though he saves us, when we become part of the family, he starts bragging about us. Jesus brags about us when we've done nothing to get to where we are. You understand this concept. All right. The great majority of children born learn how to walk, correct? But when your child takes those first 3 steps, what do? Ooh, let's get the camera. We act like it has never happened before in the history of the world. We act like this is the most incredible feat that anybody has ever done, and we are going to videotape our child walking. We begin to praise them. We begin to brag on them. If they say, "Yes, ma'am," "Oh, you're such a polite child." In fact, if our children do the things we expect them to do, typically we tend to brag on them, don't we? Is it any wonder that our God looks for opportunities to brag on us? And is it any wonder we shouldn't look for the opportunities to brag on one another? To talk about how we're brothers and sisters, we're family. We're family. It is always a case in a family, always, that one child is going to feel like the unfavorite, and one child is going to feel like the favorite, right? So who's the favorite child in your family? If you got more than one brother or sister, who's the favorite child in your family? Are you the favorite child? How many of you feel like you're the favorite child in your family? All right, we got some honest people in here. Yeah, I like that. We got some honest people saying, "Yeah, I'm the one, I'm the favorite." Yeah. How many of you feel like you got a brother or sister that's the favorite child? Yeah, okay. And if you're parents and you're looking around, you're going, "Wait a minute, that's not fair." We do that, and we do that in the church sometimes. The whole story of the prodigal son, when the prodigal son comes back, why does the older brother get mad? Because he feels like the younger brother is the favorite child, and he doesn't feel like he deserved it. I know in this church, and this is why I'm glad they're not here, I know in this church that a lot of time and energy and effort is focused on the young ladies who are in this program. And I know sometimes that feels like the rest of us get ignored, or that maybe we're not paid attention to. We've got to be careful we don't fall into the trap of the older brother, because we've got to realize that this group is only here because we are here, and because we have opened ourselves up to let God use us. They wouldn't be here. I don't know, how many baptisms have we had this year, David? Do you know? No, I think you probably shouldn't, and I'm going to get to that in a minute. And by the way, David and I didn't coordinate our comments this morning. Well, all the stuff he said and all the stuff I said just kind of happened to blend, and they're all gone, so I think God was doing something here. But I don't know how many baptisms, but we're over a dozen. We may be over 2 dozen for the year.
Probably 25 or 30 a year or something.
Okay. 25, 30 a year. Let's say you drove around the United States and you walked into, how many churches would you have to walk into before you found churches where they said we've had 25 or 30 baptisms in a year? And we've averaged that for the last several years. I bet you'd hunt for a bunch of them. And I bet when you hunted with them, every one of them said, man, I wish we could figure out how to have 25 or 30 baptisms. Now, our issue here is we're doing that. We're bringing people to Christ. People's lives are being changed by Christ. Their lives are being revolutionized by Christ. And yet sometimes it doesn't feel like we benefit, right? Sometimes it feels like we don't benefit. Well, first off, I think we benefit a lot more from them than we sometimes realize. I have. If you ever thought I wanted to study how dinosaurs fit in the Bible, but I taught a Wednesday night class on that because that was a question. That was not a question I ever thought about. But you know what? Studying that taught me some things I didn't know about the Bible. I learned. And I would have never learned except from a question from somebody who had never studied the Bible but wanted to figure out how that worked. You know, we benefit sometimes from that ways, but we benefit in other ways. And honestly, doing God's work is not what benefits us. Doing God's work is not about what benefits us. Jesus knelt in the Garden of Gethsemane and he said, please take this cup from me. But not my will, but yours be done. Was Jesus' prayer answered? Well, it was. Because God said, okay, I'm going to do my will. You said, your will be done, I'm going to do my will. And so Jesus didn't get the first thing he asked for, but his prayer was answered. And he went to the cross. Now, let's just lay this on the table. What benefit was the cross to Jesus? Not what benefit was it to us. What benefit was it to Jesus? Where was Jesus prior to being born as a baby? He was in heaven. How much power did he have in heaven before he came to earth? All power. He created the world. The world was created through him. Everything that exists was created through him. He was at the right hand of God before he became the human Jesus. And he lived and was tempted and suffered and died and was buried. And depending on how you read the scriptures, maybe he went to hell during that 3 days, maybe he didn't. Either way, it wasn't fun. He died with our sin, right? And when he rose, where did he go? Heaven, to the right hand of God, where he was before. So honestly, when God decided to send Jesus and Jesus decided to obey God and come here, Jesus knew from the moment he left there was no benefit in this journey for him other than he was doing what pleased God. That was the only benefit. And so often in our lives when we look at what goes on in our ministry to God, we talk about what benefits us or we think about what benefits us. And I talk to so many people today who's like, well, I'm looking for a church that meets my needs. You know, I'm looking for a church that meets my needs. Well, Jesus didn't come looking for a place that met his needs. His needs were met. He was already there. And he sacrificed all of that. And he sacrificed all of that for one reason and one reason only. So that he could bring the lost sons and daughters of God back to God. So these children that were lost and away from their father could come home. So that he could bring his brothers and sisters back to a place where they could be. And Jesus looked at obedience to God as a gift. Obedience to God as the gift that was the most important in his life. It wasn't important to Jesus that he have a big group of people following him. How many followed him around? 12. Maybe 20 sometimes. Now, did he preach to 5,000? Sure, he got up and preached to a big group, preached 5,000 people. And then when they realized he wasn't going to keep on feeding them and he wasn't going to become king, what did they do? Jesus didn't meet my needs, I'm gone. When Jesus died, how many do we have record of in the courtyard watching his trial? One. And he cursed him. How many do we have record of standing at the cross looking up? One. See, Jesus wasn't about the numbers of his little group. It was more, what does my little group have to offer to the world? And you got to say, those 12 who were probably somewhat disappointing during Jesus' ministry, I know there's at times where he just thought, I could just, because of the way they acted. They kind of changed the world, didn't they? They kind of revolutionized the world. And through those 12, really only 11 of them, because we know what happened to one, the entire world learned who Jesus was. Jesus, you might say, had one of the smallest congregations. Because if we had a congregation of just 12, how much would we think we could do? But Jesus, with a congregation of 12, changed the entire world. You see, I can't help but tell you that sometimes I get proud about Rimmel. And I know y'all do too, and people come and brag, and I get, pride is, I will tell you, pride is one of my issues, okay? I'll confess that. So people will be like, oh, you went out and taught Wednesday night class, and first thing I want to say is, yeah, we had about 80 people there. Because that blows people's mind that 80 people would come somewhere on a Wednesday night to do something like that. And I've started trying to quit that because I've realized that's more a pride thing. It's more me bragging about how many people show up. Or we take how much we give, or how much we do, or how many people come through the John 3:17 program, or the fact that we have the John 3:17 program, and we become confident in ourselves that we have become ministers of God. No, God has used us. We have become instruments of God. But make no mistake, whatever work is done in a church or in a family like this, it's God's work, and it should be for God's glory. And I got to remember that it's for God's glory. That I am to use my gifts and my talents and whatever God has given me to His glory in the direction He takes me. And when I do that, the blessing that comes to my life is the joy I find from finally surrendering myself to God. And surrendering myself to God does not mean doing what I like to do for God and that's all I'm going to do. Surrendering myself to God means doing what God needs me to do, whether I like it or not. The Bible's full about submission. And we studied this morning in our Bible class, our men's Bible class, we studied Ephesians 5. Submit to one another in reverence of the Lord. Then wives, submit to your husbands. Husbands, love your wives and submit to them. Everybody's submitting to everybody, back and forth, back and forth. So those of you who are married, let me ask you this. The only things you ever do for your spouse are the things you want to do, right? You never do the things you don't want to do. That's correct? No. In fact, if you're married, you have experience doing things you didn't really want to do. Well, then you're just a miserable person, aren't you? Well, hopefully not. What is the blessing that comes out of doing something for your spouse that you didn't necessarily want to do? What's the gift? She cooks you dinner. Well, that might be it. That's a good gift. Most of the time, I think the gift is when we see that what we did, even if it was not necessarily what we had chosen to do, has made a difference in the life of our spouse. It's made them happy. It's blessed them. They have a place that they wouldn't have had if we hadn't done it. And so we do things that not necessarily our idea, not necessarily what we would do at this moment or this time or this place. We do it because we love them and because what they want is most important in our lives. It's more important sometimes than what we want. And the joy of submitting ourselves to somebody else's need outweighs the fact that that wasn't exactly what we wanted to do in the first place. That's true inside this family, this congregation, the bigger family of believers, and even inside the fellowship of humanity. Those sons and daughters of Jesus, those brothers and sisters of Jesus, those sons and daughters of God, they're lost out there. They're lost out there. And when we reach out and save them by sacrificing of ourselves to do it, then what happens is, not only is God pleased, but we begin to know the joy of doing something for somebody else that has made their life better and made our Father happy and made our brother proud. The chapter goes on to say a few verses later, he says that in verse 14, since the children have flesh and blood, Jesus too shared in their humanity. So by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. We've all been held in slavery by something. We all got things in our life that we need to fix. They may not be as visible as the ladies in this ministry. But I'm going to tell you something. If you never believed before this ministry started that God could break chains, if you never believed God could change lives, that's a lesson it's taught you. And if God can do that in their life, God can do that in our life. Whatever we deal with, whatever we struggle with, whatever we're afraid of, that's not from God. That's from the devil. And the devil wants to keep us afraid. And he wants to keep us afraid because he can control us. And God breaks those chains. And we don't have to be scared. And we've learned that. We've learned that because our God was good enough to bless us with something. Something that David says we didn't look for. Something that sometimes some of us, I know, don't want because it'd be a whole lot easier not to have. Sometimes something that we're scared of because we don't know where it's going to go or what's going to happen. But I tell you what, the power of God is at work when we surrender to him. And he puts the devil to the run. And he breaks the chains in our life. So we're family. And our family is in this room. And in a special way, each of you is family to each other. But our family is also outside of this room. It's all of the believers who follow Christ. They're our brothers and sisters, and we can stand up and not be ashamed of them and not have them be ashamed of us. But our family is also this world. And it's the sons and daughters of our God who are lost in this world, who don't know how to find their way home, and to whom we may be the only signpost that crosses their path that says, Jesus is the way. Come follow me. I'm proud of this church for what it does with this ministry. I'm proud not because it's done by our effort and our success. I'm proud because it's done by God, and we go away and let God use us. If we can do that, we are going to continue to see great things happen. Not necessarily the things that benefit me, but the things that benefit God. I want to end with this thought. Jesus said, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." We've misused that verse a good bit. We think it means do unto others as I would have people do unto me right now. What it really means is if I see a homeless person, I need to do for them what I would want somebody to do for me if I was homeless. If I see a drug addict, I need to do for them what I would want somebody to do for me if I was a drug addict. If I'm a hypocrite, or I see a hypocrite, I need to do to them what I would want somebody to do to me if I was being hypocritical. Whatever I see in somebody else, I need to do for them what I would want done for me if I were in their situation. And I need to treat them how I would want to be treated if I was in their situation. And do you know, no matter what situation in life I would be in, what's the number one thing I would want for somebody? To love and respect me, in spite of what I have done. That's the number one thing I want. And the number one way we can be God's representatives is to look at His sons and daughters who are lost in this world and love and respect them and show them the way home. Maybe you haven't had the opportunity to be one of the found sons and daughters. And we sing and you have that opportunity. You can go to the front, to the back, to the middle, find somebody, hug their neck. But more, what I want us to do is I want us to spend this song that we're singing now, and I want us to reflect. Reflect on the blessing of how God has used us already, and reflect on how God's going to continue to use us to go out and find His children who the devil has kidnapped and who are lost in this world so that they can come home. Let's stand and sing.